All right, so hi, everybody. My name is Rua Williams, and I am here to talk about dealing with and figuring out what to do next after you have gotten a diagnosis for one of your family members. And I am an Indiana LEND trainee, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in a little bit. I'm also an assistant professor at Purdue University, and if you are terminally online, you can find me under the handle at Social Echo, Social Echo, Fractal Echo. Yeah. Anyway, that didn't work. Now it's not going to progress slides. It's going to be so fun. Okay. Anyway, so who am I and what do I do? I actually mostly do research and scholarship around technology and disability. I specifically investigate disability policy and where and how it fails disabled people. And I am an autistic parent of autistic children. And so I mentioned Indiana LEND, and for those of you that don't know what that is, it stands for Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, and LEND programs exist in every state in the United States. They're all run usually out of some university or another in the state. Ours is run with IU Riley Children's Hospital, and they bring in graduate students in different clinical professions. They bring in family advocates and they bring in self-advocates to learn about advocacy and community projects that they could do. And this is mine. So I sent out a survey for people that were interested in the event to get a sense of what people's feelings and thoughts were so that I could tailor this event to the families that are here. And so one of the questions that I asked was about your feelings related to the diagnosis and how you dealt with that. And we had two very different kinds of responses. We had people that felt shock and fear, and we had people that felt relief and validation. And so it tended to be that you were either in one of those or the other. You weren't really prepared or thinking that this was going to happen, or you knew that something was going on and you were probably actively fighting to get somebody to recognize it. And so that is none of those feelings are wrong or bad, or none of them are right or better. It's just that it has something to do with your experience about like where you were and your awareness of whether or not your child might have a condition. And I think that it makes a lot of sense that if you don't feel like there's anything going on with your kid, that you would be shocked, and that because you're not thinking about it, you would be unprepared, and that would cause fear. So that makes sense. And so I also asked about what people's concerns were, and there were kind of two kinds of concerns there. There were concerns for the present and there were concerns for the future. But concerns for the present had a lot to do with emotional regulation. There were some comments about dealing with aggression or other kind of behavior problems with their children. There was lots of concerns about friendships and having a good social life for their children. Really lots of concerns about whether or not their child would have friends. And also, you know, education in the sense of being included and cared for in the educational setting. And then I had a lot of people talking about how to help their child achieve their goals or even complete tasks. And that's great because we're going to talk a lot about that actually. And then concerns for the future, there was a lot of discussion in the comments of this survey about being concerned about their child's future success. And this was a lot to do with like careers or, you know, getting a job, living independently. There was a lot of people talking about whether or not their child would ever get married or have a relationship as an adult. And then there were, of course, the concerns that people have about what happens when I die. And that is a very rational thing to be worried about. And we'll talk about that a little bit also. But I want to talk about executive dysfunction first. And the reason that I want to talk about that is there's a few reasons. One, it's the thing that I've studied the most. I study it a lot. Two, I study it because it's the thing that autistic people and ADHD people and people with intellectual disabilities talk about as being the most important in their day-to-day lives. The thing that they struggle with the most is executive dysfunction. And this is the kind of finding that you get when you actually go out and ask people in the community what they deal with and what they want and need, whereas all of the research, and I have done studies on this and evaluating the research, when it's not focused on genetics and etiology, and that's where does it come from? Where does autism come from? Then it's focused on social skills training and behavioral management. And one study that I did that was looking at, one study that I did was looking at specifically technology research for autism, found 90% of those studies were about social skills training. And you talk to an autistic person and almost none of them care about that, as not to say they don't care about being social or having friends, but the idea of being taught how to be social the correct way is not really the thing that they're worried about. They're worried about how to do adult thing and pay bills. They're worried about how to do tasks. And so executive dysfunction or executive functions are these cognitive processes that govern task management, motor planning, goal setting, and other aspects of goal-oriented action. And one thing I really want to point out is that everybody has executive function. Actually, there's a joke about how researchers don't have enough executive function to define executive function, because there's a book that has like 11 chapters and every chapter has a different definition, but that's doesn't matter. But executive function is most commonly studied in ADHD, actually, much more than in autism, despite the fact that autistic people report that's my problem too. But it's also known to be something that is impacted by mental health conditions like depression, OCD, and really importantly, conditions of aging like menopause and cognitive impairment. And then, injuries, physical or emotional trauma. And the reason that I bring this up is because these are experiences that many of you might have yourselves. You may be experiencing perimenopause or menopause. You may be experiencing aging. You may be experiencing brain fog from long COVID, or you may be dealing with problems that actually share a common trait with your child, and that can be really useful to know. Okay. And so the experiences of executive function are nice to go over because I think they help really help people feel what it is that we're talking about and help them connect with what it is that they're seeing in their children. And so the experiences of executive dysfunction, and these are reported by autistic adults that I have interviewed in my research, is like feeling stuck. You are unable or unsure of what you're supposed to do next. Oops, and this one, everybody can think of one of these, like you're doing something that is repetitive and you suddenly make a weird mistake. Like you're driving to work and you suddenly make the wrong turn for some reason, or you're accidentally driving to work when you should be driving home. Disoriented, and that has to do with struggling with spatial orientation and projection. Like if you're in a new space you've never been in and you can't quite find your way around, or if you're just very stressed out in a space you're familiar with, you suddenly can't figure out how to get to the bathroom, even though you should know where it is. And then confused, it's especially, I would say stuck and confused are the most debilitating feelings related to executive function, and that's you're switching between tasks, you're having to do lots of steps and you get lost in it, and then you don't know where to go next. And so one of the things, so executive function is studied a lot in ADHD and in mild cognitive impairment or early stage dementia. We study this a lot. But what we don't study in these conditions is metacognition. And that's weird because the other place that we study executive function is in medicine, specifically surgical practice, and sports, and the military. So we study executive function in these high performance professions. And then we think about metacognitive strategies for dealing with executive function in high performance professions, but we don't think about metacognition as something that can ameliorate executive dysfunction in a disabled person. and that's silly. So executive functions are, so metacognition are the conscious and deliberate strategies and beliefs that you use to get yourself through your goals. Okay, and so we have research that shows this mediates the impacts of executive dysfunction. And that the typical, everybody does metacognition. It's just thinking about thinking. It's just having a way to deal with you might have an idea in your head about I do the dishes first and then I clean the bathroom, and then like you have some kind of pattern, and this is a metacognitive strategy. But the ones that are typical, we learn them often in school, not in any explicit way. And so they're meant to be internalized through enculturation. So this idea of like learning how to study is often something that is inexplicitly taught in the classroom. And then what we see is neurodivergent people get to college and they're like, everybody seems to know how to study and I don't. So we don't internalize these strategies the same way. And instead what we internalize is ableism. And so ableism is a term for the cultural bias and stigma against disability. And so this is the idea that people with ADHD don't have a condition, they're just lazy. So this is the thing you hear a lot, right? Autistic people need to just stop being so weird, or he could talk if he tried, or these things that we say about people, but we also say this about everybody else. So when you're driving and somebody makes a mistake, you call them some choice words, probably. And some of those words might be things like idiot or moron, which actually used to be formal diagnoses for psychiatry. And it's this idea that people in the world that inconvenience you or make you upset are somehow bad and wrong, but it's usually based on ideas about them being stupid. So we project this idea about intelligence and worth being tied together, and we don't think about it when it's just the guy in the grocery store, but we're doing that to ourselves and our families too, actually. Okay. And so, what are metacognitive strategies? These ones specifically are ones that we learned from my research with autistic adults about what do they do to manage their lives. And the kind of obvious one that you see a lot in literature for education is like task chunking. And this is just, you take a big thing and you figure out how to break it down, because you have the big thing and it's impossible to do because it's big and scary. So how do you break it down? But even that requires some amount of executive function, and that's usually where you need help from other people. Visual and tactile. So this is important because a lot of you who have maybe had a diagnosis for your child for longer will maybe have had some experience with being given visual schedules or planners, right? Those work because they provide an executive function scaffold for your child. And if they don't work, it's because that is not gelling, right? So, tactile. You ever, like, you're leaving your house and you do like the spectacle, testicles, watch, wallet, keys. You do like a thing and you touch like all your parts and figure out if you have your keys in your wallet and stuff, right? That's a tactile metacognitive strategy that you develop so that you wouldn't forget something really important, okay? So echopraxia, that's a fancy word, and it really just means working alongside somebody else, or like that it can be easier to go through the motions of something if other people around you are doing it. And this is a lot of why, for example, a child might do better in school and be able to handle transitions at school and not be able to handle transitions in the home, because all the other kids are doing it. And they're giving all of these little cues about, okay, it's time to line up. And it comes in a pattern and it's very routine and everybody else is doing it. And so it's sort of easy to flock like a bird, okay? And that's not true. It's not easy for everybody. It's different, but a lot of times people will have this experience of, my kid is a good kid at school and at home they fall apart, and they fall apart because they spent all their time trying to stay together at school. And then goes. The big strategy that really comes from the autistic community is anti-ableism. And this is actually internalizing a sense of community and a sense of that you're not broken. Okay, you have a sense of identity as a person that deals with executive function problems, and that doesn't make you bad or wrong or immoral or lazy. It just means you need different kinds of supports to get through the day than everybody else. And this is a terrible graphic that's really annoying to read. We're not really going to read it, but I wanted to show you the different kinds of domains that you can think about if you're trying to think about how to implement strategies for your family in the home. Okay. Particularly with a child that has problems with sensory issues, then having a lot of choice in the environment and control over the environment for that person, over the light and sound, can be really helpful. And that doesn't mean necessarily that your lighting and sound in your house is dictated by a 4-year-old. It means that if you can't turn off the lights because you need them, then the kid can have sunglasses. Or if you can't turn off the sound because you're cooking and you have to use the blender, then the kid gets air defenders, right? They have control over the sensory input that they receive from their environment. The mental ones are things like internalizing the routines. And so there's this kind of myth actually in care for autistic children that insists that autistic children need structure and routine. And the reason that it is a myth is because it works. It works because it takes the executive function burden away from the child. But that's not actually solving the problem. It's making them dependent upon somebody else's structure, somebody else's scaffold, somebody else's visual schedule. It doesn't actually teach them how to create their own metacognitive strategies for dealing with transitions and executive function demands. And so you get this kind of myth that they need structure because when you implement structure, it can often take away the distress because you took away the burden of executive function that was really bothering somebody. And then, you know, and there are sort of the embodied domain has a lot to do with the other side of sensory. So where environmental might be sensory input, embodied is sensory output, allowing for heavy work, allowing for movement, letting kids walk around, letting kids be silly, giving them time in a, you know, some people have like little soft play gyms they've built into their basements. That's quite fancy, but I just have a trampoline and I can't wait for all the broken arms. So there are lots of things, but the thing that people underestimate is the power of the social domain. An example is when I talked about task trunking, I said it can be really hard to break down a big task into smaller tasks because that in itself is a task. You can actually, the autistic adults in my studies would rely on each other. And there is this phenomenon where an autistic person can do something for somebody else that they can't do for themselves. And I'll give you a personal example. I will not call the doctor. I would rather die. But I have called the doctor for my friends because I don't want them to die. So an example, I had a friend who had all of her meds were out. And so I did all of the phone calls pretending to be her with all of her information to get all of her meds refilled. I could do that for her because something about the executive function process of helping somebody else feels different than helping myself. I think it has something to do with not having to have the fear of rejection. Like if the receptionist on the other end of the line is not being helpful for my friend, that's a problem to solve. If they're not being helpful for me, that's a catastrophe and I should just die. So that's kind of where, and so these social things become very obvious for autistic adults in adulthood. And I think we are just now starting to explore how do you bring that into the lives of children? And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But there's something really important and very sad that I want to talk about first. Okay. I'm actually gonna read a little something. So I'm 38. I'm gonna look at this camera so that the recording is, anyway. I'm 38, and 2 years ago I turned 36. And my birthday congratulations on social media included phrases like, "You made it," and "You're an elder now." Because the average life expectancy for an autistic person is 36 years old. Autistic people are twice as likely to die from unnatural causes as the general population. And this is true whether or not we have co-occurring medical conditions such as epilepsy or cerebral palsy. And we have exceptionally high rates of death from injury, which includes suffocation, drowning, and suicide. In autistic children, the incidence of suicidal thoughts and behaviors has been found to be 28 times higher than in other children. 72% of autistic adults experience suicidal thoughts compared to 33% of the general population. And researchers have begun investigating why suicidality is so much higher in autistic people. It used to be in the 90s, the research would just say we're predisposed to it. Like we just genetically want to die harder. That's not accurate. And we've done more research and found that there's a significant effect of experiences of social stigma, the stress of trying to fit in with other people, and feelings of failure and shame. So shame is a uniquely pernicious emotion. It is impossible to feel shame without other people. A baby does not feel shame. We learn shame from each other, and we pass shame around like an infection. The things that we are ashamed of are the things that we punish other people for. Everywhere, in every culture, autistic people are learning to be ashamed of themselves from the people around them, and it is killing us. Now, I think these kinds of conversations are very difficult for families because the first thing they think of is that it's their fault. My parents loved me. I was wanted and I was loved, but I still learned shame. I learned shame not because they were ashamed of me, but because they were ashamed of themselves in ways that they didn't understand and that they were afraid. My mother's uncles were all institutionalized in one way or another. And so she had this sense that she had the R word baked into her genes and that she was terrified and ashamed that somebody would notice me and take me away. My favorite great uncle was Bobby. He was the one that I got to see the most. He only spent time in a day center until my great grandmother passed away. And he loved gardening and landscaping. He was almost always outside tending to the yard because there wasn't really much else to do, but he really enjoyed it. There are photos of him in my great grandmother's house of him holding me when I was a baby, and he was so proud. He would call me his porcupine, and I remembered this from my memories all the way up into my teen years. And sometimes when he was angry, though, he also called me the R word, because that's what they called him. So when families receive a diagnosis of a developmental disability like autism, all those big feelings that they experience, the worry, the grief, and the fear, it's all fueled by shame. Shame fed to them by a society that says there are only certain kinds of children worth celebrating and only certain kinds of lives worth living. And you may not think that you are ashamed, and I believe that most of you are not ashamed of your children. But when you worry about their future, about their success, about their relationships, about their independence, what drives that worry? It's the conviction that's been sold to you by other people that a life that looks different from a happily married, career-oriented adult is something bad and tragic and to be feared. Now, at the beginning of this, I told you I was an assistant professor. So yes, I went and I got my PhD, and I'm I'm one of the smart ones, or whatever gross thing people say. But I almost didn't make it. And I almost failed out of college my first semester, and I almost took my own life in the middle of my graduate studies. And at that time I was already a mother, so that would have been bad. But in my friends networks and in the people that I have interviewed for my research, there are all kinds of people that have all kinds of different lives. And some of the ones that have the highest education are not actually the happiest. And I have friends that never graduated high school or that didn't graduate college. It's very common for us to get kicked out of college for being too ADHD, actually. And while that was definitely a struggle for them, and many of them are living in poverty, I think they would definitely like to not live in poverty, but I don't think that actually changed anything about their lives. You know what I mean? Like, poverty is not something that they did to themselves. It's something that we did to everyone. And I have a cousin who is 26 or something like that, and his mother was certain that he was going to become a mathematics professor. He is a manager at a grocery store, and that's been a struggle for her, but I think he's actually fine. I think he's actually having a great time. And so in my advocacy work, I have been hosting a series of workshops on managing cognitive struggles as neurodivergent adults. And this work is based on my research with autistic adults. But the key lesson that I learned in their testimonies is that the biggest challenge to working through executive function struggles is actually working through shame and finding community. And so I'm trying to bring this lesson to families. And so tonight, we're going to explore some of the worries, fears, and secret shames that will eventually influence how your child feels about themselves. I want to help families process which aspects of their worries are opportunities for a deeper understanding and community building, and which aspects are opportunities for abolishing shame and the shame that they carry in their families. And it's my hope that more connected, liberated families can protect us against the shame that's been eating us alive. So that was my sad part. Okay. And so I want to talk about cycles of support that you can build into your home, into your child's school, into your child's life, into your family. These cycles can come with you no matter where you are. Although, yes, absolutely, having a little sensory hidey hole in the house is an excellent choice. Okay. But you know, at the top of this cycle, I have sensory control. And what I mean by that is that if a child has agency over the sensory experiences that are happening to them, they can better regulate their emotions. The sensory stuff happens at a very visceral level. And if that is not going well, they can't think through the other things. Okay. Task scaffolds. And some of this means those visual schedules. There's nothing wrong with them. They're pretty cute. I know adults that still use them and kind of wish that they didn't look so childish. But like, those things can work, are good. You can make your own. You can build your own visual cues around the house to support somebody through the steps they need to do in order to get their life done. And this, if there are, and then I include this, honestly, well, I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but you can have scaffolds for emotional regulation. And actually, some children's shows like Daniel Tiger and Bluey do this really well. They have these certain episodes that really illustrate this. I mean, there's one where like Bluey's really upset and Chili, I don't know, it's Bingo that's upset. Anyway, Chili, the mom, you know, says like, you know, you take a deep breath and you dust yourself off and you, like, I don't remember all the steps. I should look it up. It's very cute. Anyway, but it has to do with acknowledging your feelings, breathing so that you can actually have oxygen go to your brain. Super important. And then going and figuring out what the next step is. Okay. And so I just wanted to mention that you can have scaffolds for stuff that aren't just getting dressed and brushing your teeth. Okay. And this next one is called unconditional positive regard. And you hear this discussed in other places as like, children do well when they can. Okay, so when you, and that has to do with like the sensory and the task management and the emotional stuff. If those things are not cared for or structured or supported, then they can't do well, right? But this also comes from the work of Alfie Kohn, who is a researcher who writes a number of very good books. And really what he means by this is, yes, your children are going to do frustrating things, and the people in your life, your partner, is going to do frustrating things, and you're going to be really upset, right? But it's never condemning them as a person. I actually do this in my classrooms with my undergrad and graduate students. I do this when they work in groups. I tell them that they have to have unconditional positive regard for their classmates, that one of them is probably going to disappear, right? The group project always has like that slacker or whatever. And I try to teach them that that person is not a slacker. That person is undoubtedly dealing with something. And that could be that they just don't want to be there, and that's fair. Or it could be that they're dealing with things that you could not imagine. I've had students dealing with domestic violence. One of my students was literally trapped in her apartment by her partner for 6 months. So like they're going through something you don't know about. And so with unconditional positive regard, I tell my students to always give that person, that slacker in the group, a chance every time. And it's very similar to the things that you see about always inviting your introvert friends to the party, even if they say no, because one day they're going to say yes, but it might be the day that you don't invite them because you think they're going to say no. So you always invite that person to do a task. You give them an update, you tell them what they could do, but you make a plan for what to do if they don't do it. But you always give them a chance to contribute, because your grade is not going to fail because of this one person, okay? So that's a context of like teaching in the classroom. At home, it means, and I struggle with this because 4-year-olds are very annoying. But like, when they're doing like some really terrible things, throwing stuff, hitting you, whatever, they're not brats. They're not mean children. They're not bad people. They're just not supported. Right. And that is really hard to deal with because I'm the mother and I'm supposed to research this stuff. I'm supposed to be like good at it. And I'm not. And it's very sad. I'm like, I am breaking you. Hooray. I am so greatly excited about how bad I am at this. But that actually brings me to some other things that we'll talk about. And that, co-regulation is a big deal. So you can't help your child through their emotions if you can't help yourself through your emotions. And so you can model helping yourself through your emotions, and your kids will pick that up. So the one thing that I am fairly capable of is apologizing when I'm wrong. I can do that. And talking through, like, I shouldn't have let myself get so angry. I should have taken a break, right? And then the next thing is celebration. And I put in the survey for people to tell me things that they loved about their children, and y'all are so cute. These kids are funny. And my favorite part is how loving they are, because there's all that research that says that we have no empathy and that we're like monsters. But these kids are really sweet and really empathetic. They don't always know what to do with those feelings, but they do feel things for them, for their friends and their family. It's just really one of my favorite things is when a parent thinks their kid is funny, because I think that laughter is the best, and the idea that like your kid makes you laugh is such a source of joy. And I just really think that that's beautiful, and you should celebrate it. You may have noticed there's an awful lot of autistic comedians coming out. We're really funny. So But what your child needs most is community. This is an image of Stacy Park Milburn, who was a disability activist in the Bay Area, San Francisco. And she led many movements for mutual aid and organizing, particularly around the PG&E fires and COVID. So she and her friends organized transport and, materials delivery, food and power, like to people that like needed power to live during rolling brownouts. And they worked on creating PPE, like masks and hand sanitizer bottles, and basically like, COVID prophylaxis kits, and delivered them all over the place. And she passed away in 2020, but one of my favorite quotes from her is that through loving disabled people, I get to love myself. I feel very strongly that there are not enough autistic friendships in childhood, that our children need to be each other's friends. And there are several reasons why that doesn't happen. One of them is literally that I think some doctors are still saying, keep your kid away from the other ones. There was this idea that like, if you put us all in a room together, we get more autistic. It's true. And the doctors don't like it. So there's that. And then there's this idea that that happens when you're told that your child has a social deficit. The idea that comes into your head is, I can fix it by giving this child many social experiences with the normal ones. And so you're constantly seeking these friendships with people that are just kind of not, it's not that you can't have friendships with you can, it's fine. But there's a kind of friendship that autistic people can have with each other that so many of us are not finding until we're adults, and it's devastating. And so I'm really encouraging people to have local play groups. And I don't mean like activities. I mean, basically a flash mob. Like on this date at this time, all of our autistic children are going to be in the same place. There's no structured activity. There's no obligations. It's just, we're all going to be there in the same place at the same time. And they're going to probably parallel play. And if it's at a museum, then there's going to be a lot of dinosaur noises, and it's going to be cool. Like, that's what I mean when I say an autistic play date. I mean, just like get them all in the same space and don't force them to do things. So we'll see if anybody will do those with me. That'd be nice. And then the other thing is that you need autistic friends also. And this is whether or not you yourself, many of you are figuring out that the cause of autism is autistic people fornicating, like we make ourselves. So some of you have already recognized, the autism is calling from inside the house. Like, you know that, right? But some of you don't, and not all of you are. But you all need autistic friends. And you need those friends because they understand your child, they understand you, they understand your family, and they can give you a kind of friendship that you have never experienced before. And your children need to see adults like them. I believe this for all disabilities. I desperately wish that children with Down syndrome grew up knowing adults with Down syndrome, and that children with spina bifida grew up knowing adults with spina bifida. I desperately wish this. And I really wish that we would all play together too, actually. But that is what I mean by community, and that you need it. And so I'm going to talk about a few resources, and then we're going to do Q&A, and we can workshop people's specific problems. Okay, so in the Indiana area, actually the whole like Midwest, there's a group called the Great Lakes and Midwest and Plains Equity Center. And I'm bringing this up because one of my best friends works at this thing, and it's amazing. So it has to do with educational equity and justice. And so they do all kinds of things like consulting in schools and programming for that, but also like investigations and expert witness testimony and kind of stuff. And then there's in-source, which I think maybe a lot of you know about, but maybe some of you have not yet been introduced to this, because it's possible to get a diagnosis and not sort of be referred to the accommodations in the school system. I want you to know that even if your kid does well, there's probably an accommodation that could help them be less miserable. And then the other resources are each other, and the thing I talked about before about you need autistic friends. I don't know. I'm from Florida, and I think that the Midwest is broken. And like, Florida's not a picnic. There's a bunch of like fascism and alligators and mosquitoes down there. But like, y'all don't talk to each other. Maybe y'all just don't like me. That's fine. But like, I can't get when I have my kids in a space with a bunch of like other kids and parents, those parents will not speak to me. And they don't speak to each other either, unless they went to high school together. What is that? Anyway, y'all need to be friends. We need to be friends with each other. And there's lots of like support groups on the internet, but there aren't like those friendships that I am used to seeing. And maybe it's not the whole Midwest. Maybe it's just West Lafayette, because that place sucks. And so that's, I don't know. And then other resources, Foundations for Divergent Minds, and this is a nonprofit organization that does training for parents, clinicians, schools. They do so many wonderful things, and they are completely autistic led, and they are led by a team of racially and gender diverse people, and I love them. And so that's divergentminds.org, and they do stuff, and you should participate. And then I have a neurodivergent burnout series. It's a bunch of webinars that I do every now and then, and if you just look on YouTube for me, you find them. Okay, and so these are mostly for adults so far, but you're adults, so watch them. And so, yeah, that's it for the me talking at you part, and now it's the ask me things part. All done.
Do you mind going back a slide?
So you can type in the chat. There's like a Q&A like panel. You can use it if you want to. It's not necessary. And you can unmute, but I actually don't know if I can hear you. So going back a slide, you bet I can go back a slide. Boop. Or that you wanted the barcode. Yeah, so I guess I can't hear you because you said that you spoke before, and you try again.
Hello.
No, I can't hear you. That's a bummer. So you can type, and then I can answer you, and also hilariously, the recording will have your voice on it. And there's a few people in the room who can also ask things. That would be cool. Then fine. For very young kids, the reason why the visual. Oh, so let me restate the question in case you couldn't hear it from this microphone. It was about like where to start with executive function skills or metacognitive strategies for kids. And it's like for very young kids, there's a reason why all of those places have been giving out those visual schedules for so long. It's because of like it's kind of hard to communicate with somebody that doesn't have full language yet, or maybe might really struggle for a long time to have oral language, right? But honestly, video games are an excellent teacher for executive function strategies because that's literally what it is. It's a very structured environment in which to experience tasks, chunking, goal setting, planning. And that's actually probably why so many autistic people find solace in video games, is because it's a place where the parts of their brain that struggle don't struggle so hard. And it's cool. But you can actually think about, like, you can talk to your kids about what they're doing and how it relates to things that they would do in the physical world. So, you know, they're talking about Minecraft or Roblox, and they are not stopping. And you can make connections between that thing and something else that they like. And eventually, you know, if you do this for like 3 or 4 years, they will get it, right? But I think that for teens and adults, the videos that I have are probably better than anything I could spit out in a second. So, yes, you can ask little ASD kid questions. I have a little ASD kid. One of the things about executive function in particular, although I will mention, is that there's like a crisis point of it in middle school, and this is this is like all humans, and that is why middle schools, like if you look at like the scores of schools, the middle schools are always lower because they're all strung out on hormones and they can't function. Like, but autistic people, oftentimes, if they don't get a diagnosis as a small child, they will get it in middle school, or they will have a significant psychological crisis in middle school. But so it came up. Okay, so the ABA thing came up. So I'll talk about it a little bit. I am a researcher, and I have read a lot of the science, and the science is not there. However, many people will argue that that's the old ABA. I'm talking about stuff that was written this year. And there are things that people are still doing, particularly with children and adults that do not speak, that are very horrific. And these are licensed behavior analysts that are squirting lemon juice in children's mouths and tying kids' hands to the chair. And there is still electroshock, not electroshock therapy, that's something else. There's actual, I'm sorry. So there's electroconvulsive therapy that's also problematic, but there's actually skin shock. Like, they are zapping children and adults at a center in Massachusetts, and we have campaigned for years to get them to stop, and they keep getting the government to overturn our bans. And these are licensed BCBAs, and the Behavior Analyst Certification Board has nothing to say about how this is obviously an ethics violation, right? So as an institution, I think that ABA is trash. However, resources are sparse, and some daycares won't take your kid. So if you need to use an ABA center as a state, or unfortunately sometimes privately funded daycare, then you should do that. And you know, you work with that specific team, and you set boundaries about what they can and can't do to your child, right? And so I just have to be realistic about, like, not all families can choose to just not do it. And that's actually one of the reasons why I recommend Foundations for Divergent Minds, is because they do work with reform in ABA. And so, yes. With that there. Yes, absolutely. So the other person in the room said, like, it doesn't matter what the therapy is, you and the child should be actively involved in like the idea of the treatment plan and like what happens in a session. Big red flags are if they won't let you go back with the kid. I know sometimes they say it's because the kid doesn't behave the same way when the parents are there, but absolutely not. No. And I, as an adult human being, have been assaulted by therapists. So that's fun. Don't trust them with your children just because they're in a helping profession. Some of them are doing it for weird reasons. And so that's my advice on therapy. One thing I will say about therapies, and this is for all children with any kind of condition, impairment, disability, whatever. There is this tendency to be so worried about what will happen to them when they're adults that you turn their childhood into a job, where the therapy is their job, where it's their job to become normal enough to be independent, and they spend their entire childhood in therapy. And this has been the case for disabled children for decades, and it's not just restricted to autism. The kinds of physical therapy that children with cerebral palsy go through. I have a friend named Norman Kunk who has a chapter somewhere in a book called The Stairs Go to Nowhere. And it was where he was like forced to climb like these therapeutic stairs, the same kind that you would do for somebody who is recovering from a stroke, right? And the idea was that he has to climb stairs because he can't ever, because it has, and it was like literally half his childhood was spent practicing climbing stairs. He's been in a wheelchair his entire adult life. It's much more effective, right? We turn this idea of therapy into like a job. Disabled children don't have childhoods because they're like compelled to do therapy. It's exhausting. Also, there is a comment in here, and I'm going to go ahead and address it because I feel like being an asshole. Yes, so as an autistic and a queer person, also me, ABA is for autistics what conversion therapy is for queer folks. Now, this can be, again, like I said, like sometimes ABA is just daycare, right? But literally the science was the same. The researchers were the same. The papers in the archives about conversion therapy for effeminate boys is led by the same researchers that founded ABA as a practice. So it's literally the same at the root. So we have a comment here about twins, and daughter is academically ready for first grade, but struggles with social interactions. She would benefit with confidence in learning social cues. Oh, you think maybe she would be better off starting in kindergarten first because of the like social play-based aspect of that. So the decision whether or not to put your child in kindergarten versus first grade, when academically they fit into first grade, but you're worried about their social success or safety, feeling, good about themselves socially in the first grade setting. One, I think we underestimate how really cool kids can be. Most of the time when I see big problems with bullying, it's actually a lot more to do with the adults in the room than the kids. And so I would be more concerned with figuring out ways to introduce neurodivergent affirming play and socialization practices to the classroom for all the kids than about keeping her in a kindergarten class thinking that that's somehow going to fix the problem. But I mean, you know your kid best, and you can make that choice yourself. And also you may not actually have the option. You might have a school that seems really not ready to listen to things. And so you have to make the choice that you, you actually have available to you. Like sometimes you don't actually have all the choices available. Patrick, is this your mom? Yeah. Hi, Pat's mom. No, not you. No, I knew Deanna wasn't Patrick's mom. I just noticed a name in the participant list that was Patrick's last name. Anyway, so, but yeah, I'm trying to make sure I didn't miss any questions. I'm going to allow for a few more minutes of awkward silence while I wait to see if you have more questions. Just a little, get a sense of who's in the room, like who has children under 10. I was just kind of gonna get a sense of who had like small children and who had like adolescents and who had adults. Yeah. Because, we can talk about issues with any of the age groups, it's fine. But we have a question, 13 and 36. My sister is 17 years younger than me. It happens. Okay. So there is a question about a resource for a speaker on neurodivergence in healthcare. And do you mean specifically neurodivergent people receiving healthcare or like neurodivergent doctors? But anyway, I'm trying to think about a speaker that does this specifically. And I don't have one in my head right now, but I do know that this is something that a lot of us talk about, which is that one of the other reasons why our life expectancy is so shit is because the doctors do not listen to us. And we have a lot of co-occurring conditions that we are beginning to find in the literature, but the other problem is that we act like autistic adults don't exist. The first man diagnosed with autism in the United States passed away in 2019 or thereabouts, and he was 86. So we have a few adults we could be studying, but we have chosen to pretend that they do not exist. And so we don't know, for example, what happens to us as we age. Weirdly, there are studies that have noticed similarities in the brains between autistic children and people with Parkinson's, and I'm like, maybe they're the same people. My great-grandmother got Alzheimer's, and like maybe we're more predisposed to that. I would like to know. Like these are things that we struggle with. And there's high rates of postural orthostatic tachycardia, which is basically a propensity for fainting and other kinds of like feeling bad tummy aches. And Ehlers-Danlos or hypermobility spectrum conditions. So Laffy Taffy for joints instead of elastic. That's the thing that we deal with. And those are things that take sometimes up to a decade to diagnose. And it's harder for us because we get kind of treated like we're crazy, which, I mean, I am, like a lot of us are also that, but can be correct about what we're feeling and experiencing. It's kind of like not fair. Meds. I really wish that somebody would have given me Ritalin as a child. That would have been probably really great for me and how I felt about myself. I am an adult and I take it now and I'm like, oh my God, I can read. That's not fair. I didn't realize that I could do that. And I did read a lot as a child when it was like fantasy and stuff, but like the idea of like reading something to learn, ugh, that was too hard. It required too much cognitive. You had to hold all the information in your head and like see how it related, and it was hard. And meds would have been great. My kids take meds and they are doing much better in school than emotionally than I was. And I mean, the teachers know when they don't have it. Like, I think there was this myth in the 90s in particular that persisted into the 2000s that these medications turned your kids into zombies. And the thing is that like people would be confusing ADHD stimulants with like the antipsychotics that they like to give to autistic children. Those do make you a zombie because they're antipsychotics. Right. So, but like, no, I think that stimulant medications are fantastic. And there are some non-stimulant ones. There are some reasons why you wouldn't want a stimulant one. Like if you've got a hole in your heart, you shouldn't take a stimulant. But you know, the meds help with the executive function part. That's like literally what they do. I am a safer driver on my meds than without them. I think about it like this, and there's memes about this. If you don't make your own neurotransmitters, store-bought is fine. So I have lots of store-bought neurotransmitters to keep me from wanting to die and also to keep me from crashing my car. And I think that's great. So explaining the difference between autism and ADHD, this is fun. Okay. So there's a few things to know here. First is that until 2013, you were not allowed to be diagnosed with both. They were listed in the diagnostic manual as mutually exclusive diagnoses. However, we have done research and we have figured out that the range is really wide because we don't have a solid number, but 50 to 80% of autistic people are also ADHD. A friend of mine, actually the founder of Foundations for Divergent Minds, has said that one of the major differences between an autistic person with ADHD and one without is that somebody without ADHD that is also autistic actually has working memory. And I don't mean like that their memory works. I mean specifically the memory that is like short-term that you use to like switch out things. That seems to be one of the major differences that you can recognize in the life of somebody, I guess. And then my personal experience is that when you meet somebody with ADHD that is not autistic, they remind you of a golden retriever. And I don't mean that in a bad way. And I don't just mean that they're extroverts, like they're extroverted autistic people. I just mean that they seem more happy-go-lucky. And that doesn't mean they're always happy. They just, they seem like they're not dealing with a bunch of extrasensory shit. Okay. So yeah, peppy. They're bubbly. They got bubbles. They're like sparkling water. I don't know. That just killed Patrick. Anyway, all you ADHD people that are like, I don't have autism, but I have sensory issues, it's autism. Okay. Okay. Anyway, you can fight us. You could start a fight on TikTok about it, but I don't care. Okay. But the other thing to know is that all of the things that are inside the diagnostic manual are, in some cases, the fever dream of like 5 white dudes in a trench coat. Like they don't, most of them are not real in the sense that like you can actually prove them with any kind of science. Now they're real in the sense that there are clusters of people that share these experiences, right? But that's why we talk about like we're better at diagnosing each other than the doctors are. Okay. Like these clusters of conditions change all the time, and some of them are technically qualify as totally made up if you look at the science, right? But like I said, that doesn't mean that like that the identity is not useful for finding each other and for finding community and figuring out what works for you, right? But like, what is the difference between autism and ADHD? It's actually just soup. It's just soup up there. It's not a thing. There's actually a recent study that came out that's really amazing. They had a huge sample of people with multiple conditions all across the DSM, and they had them like list their symptoms basically, and they reclustered those symptoms, and what they found was that there was really no statistically significant correlation between the diagnosis and the cluster symptom, like the symptom clusters. So like there is not a compelling difference between me and a schizophrenic person. The experience is different in the sense that a schizophrenic person is much more likely to get arrested. And that's also because that diagnosis has been given to Black people more often in the recent years. So like there's this thing where the diagnosis sometimes determines how you get treated. And so that determines your experiences. But when you actually talk to one another, there's way more similarities between you than what the book says. The book is trash. The book includes a diagnosis that I particularly hate, which is oppositional defiant disorder, that literally describes children as being vindictive. And I think that that is a human rights violation. These are children that are enduring some kind of trauma, or that they're just ADHD and autistic and they need some supports. These are not vindictive children. You can't call a child vindictive. That's nuts. Anyway, I have lots of feelings about the DSM, but no, we don't need to talk about them. And so, we have a few more minutes left technically because I'm not kicked out of the room until later, but if you have anything else I can say, if I made you mad, that's, you could tell me, that'd be neat to know. Oh, there's a message. School hating PDA 11-year-old boy transitioning to middle school. Middle school's the worst. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance. Now, this is one of those terms that gets a whole bunch of discourse on the TikTok about its validity or whatever. I personally don't like the term in the same way that I don't like calling a child vindictive. I don't like calling somebody pathologically defiant. Or demand avoidant, pathologically demand avoidant. But I do think that, yes, the persistent drive for autonomy is a nice like reconfiguration of the acronym. And what I like to tell people is that the experience of PDA is one that is highly driven by executive function. If you think about it, what makes a demand overwhelming is that it's a transition. Every time you tell somebody to do something that they're not currently doing, you've interrupted what they're doing. You've made them think about what you asked them to do, and they're thinking about all the steps in between this and that. And they're thinking about this is going to get interrupted and possibly in their mind especially, but also truthfully destroyed. So the thing that they're doing is going to be ruined if they move. They're never going to be able to figure out how to get back to it. That's how they feel, right? So of course they just sit there and they don't listen to you, or they scream, right? That's kind of terrifying. This idea that like you were doing a thing and now you have to kill it to do what somebody else is asking you to do. And there's a whole bunch of steps involved in doing it. And it's not fun. Like that's rough. Okay. It's really just not great. And so there are lots of like strategies for PDA or whatever that have to do with using less direct language, which is kind of funny because we're very direct people, but like the idea of being like, I need you to put on your shoes in a few minutes, so start thinking about how you can stop your game. It really has a lot to do with preempting, basically preempting the surprise of the demand, right? And it has to do with like, you know, multiple cues and multiple ways of making that demand not unexpected and like an interruption. But it's not always gonna work. It's just kind of, that's, if you think about how disorienting that is, it can be easier to understand it and then maybe think about how to preempt it. And it has a lot to do with setting expectations well before, like, okay, it's Saturday morning and we have to go to the grocery store in an hour and a half. You can play your Switch, but I'm gonna need you to start getting dressed in an hour. So I'm gonna remind you every few minutes how much time you have so you can think about how to get to a stopping spot in your game. It doesn't really always work good, but it's one of those things, like if you do it for like 4 years, it suddenly starts working. Anyway. And actually, the thing about electronics, I resent this as a person who's obsessed with video games and electronics and studies them for a living. But it is actually true that sometimes it is better to not have them as much. And so my kids do. Like, I have actually gotten my 10-year-old to admit that she feels better when we don't use the tablet on the weeknights. She's like, my head feels better. And I'm like, can't argue with that. So yes, electronics can be regulating, but they can also, you can regulate yourself into dysregulation. Right? So, but yeah, but that doesn't mean that like the answer is take the tablet away for every kid. That's just, but yeah, I can't believe I got a 10-year-old to admit that her brain feels better when she's not using it. That's fascinating. Anyway, yeah, so, I could do like one more and then we'll be done. And also, like, I gave my my social media handle, you can find me. And also if you want to ask things, you can email me. I put that in the chat for you. Come on, Patrick's mom, what question do you have? Okay. Okay. All right. I'll release everybody from this awkward hell. You can be done. And thank you for coming. And if you see the event around again, maybe tell your friends, because I'd like to do more of them. And that's, thank you for coming and goodbye. I don't know how to stop talking. Present for a living and I can't stop, but I can't end the conversation. It's like it's in my file. It's a clinical condition.